Okay, I think we're going to get started. You read if you're ready.
Yes, ready.
Wonderful. Okay, everyone, welcome. Good afternoon. My name's Rachel Libman, and I'm the Chief Curator of the Toronto Holocaust Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our special Neuberger Holocaust Education Week webinar with Dr. Irit Felsen. For this special program, the Toronto Holocaust Museum has partnered with the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence and UJA's Human Services One Community Cares Knowledge Exchange Series, an initiative to strengthen the diverse network of agencies serving the Jewish community. Today's HEW webinar is also part of the One Community Cares Knowledge Exchange Series of virtual lunchtime meetings on relevant topics delivered to partner agency staff. For more information about those, please reach out to my colleague, Khani. Thank you to UJA, our sustaining partner, and to the Azrieli Foundation for their extraordinarily generous support of the Toronto Holocaust Museum and Holocaust Education Week. Neuberger HEW is generously supported by the Neuberger and York families. And thank you, our audience, for being here today during what I am sure are busy schedules for what we know will be an exceptional learning opportunity for all of us. When planning Neuberger Holocaust Education Week, our team knew we wanted to learn from Dr. Irit Felsen again. We first worked with Irit during the early COVID days. I don't know if you remember this, Irit.
I do.
When Irit led a webinar for descendants on coping through lockdown through the lens of intergenerational trauma. I don't remember much from those days, but I do remember how capably and caringly Irit answered our questions, channeled our fears, and beautifully helped us make some sense of how descendants were uniquely responding to the pandemic. Since then, Irit has led some timely studies that we have encouraged descendants to participate in. Her work took on new meaning post-October 7th, when descendants of Holocaust survivors again experienced responses to fear, shock, and grief that emerged from trauma and intergenerational trauma. Irit joined us at the Toronto Holocaust Museum this past June as we marked 1 year since our opening, to offer some incredible reflections and ways to understand the impact of October 7th and its aftermath on Holocaust survivors, their children, and grandchildren. We knew there was much more to learn from her and invited her back for a longer session today. We know that caring for Holocaust survivors and their descendants as they age in clinical and caregiving capacities offers challenges due to the ways this community uniquely experiences and responds to trauma and loss. Irit will walk us through this reality, offering us insight to help us better understand and share practical suggestions for your work with this population, rooted in her expertise and extensive research. As well, research on Holocaust families paved the way for examining multi-generational transmission of trauma in other trauma-exposed populations. And studies have revealed that there are some fundamental shared mechanisms and unique characteristics for specific traumatic experiences in each group. We hope that this program will help you in your work, in your approaches, and in your lives to better understand the impact of intergenerational trauma on families of Holocaust survivors, providing you with some strategies that support coping mechanisms in multi-generational client systems. Irit Felsen, PhD, is a clinical psychologist specializing in the effects of trauma and traumatic loss, and the intergenerational transmission of both trauma and resiliencies in families of Holocaust survivors. Dr. Felsen is an adjunct professor at Columbia University and at Yeshiva University in New York City, co-chair of the Trauma Working Group in the NGO on Mental Health in the United Nations, and chair of the Older Adult Work Group in the Interdivision APA COVID-19 Task Force. She maintains a private practice in Englewood, New Jersey. Dr. Felsen's research papers and book chapters have been published in peer-reviewed publications. In addition, Dr. Felsen's art has been featured in art exhibitions in Hamburg, London, and New Jersey. Following Irit's presentation, we will open up the floor for your questions via Q&A function in the chat. As well, Irit has some handouts that she will send to us, and we will circulate them to you following this webinar. Thank you so much, and now the floor is yours, Irit.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel, for such a beautiful introduction and for the opportunity to continue working together, which I thoroughly enjoy. And really thank you for the audience that chose to spend time. All our time is so precious these days together today. I love Toronto. I love your beautiful city. It's also my husband's home city. And I really appreciate this honor of working with you again and being together today. I will open I'll I'll share screen now. Let me see here. Share. Yeah. So I always start for years now, and especially these days, with the only single photo of my family that perished in the Holocaust. That's the only photo that we have that survived the war. It was sent to one of my father's sisters before the war. She was already not in Poland, and so we have this one photo. And that is very important to me these days, especially as people begin to brazenly claim that this did not actually happen. So I think a couple of you might have been there in our previous meeting, and you might recognize that I used this line from Linda Paston's poem, "For Jews, the Cossacks are always coming," which she wrote quite a few years ago. And this line and the poem in its entirety captures this feeling, this intergenerationally transmitted anticipation of being attacked. And it used to seem very out of context, very exaggerated in our North American times here 10, 20 years ago, an exaggerated, somewhat neurotic manifestation of intergenerational transmission. And it seemed just about as foreign as Cossacks would be in contemporary American or North American Jewish life. But this all changed very drastically after October 7, when one of these horrific pogroms took place in Israel, as we all know. And since then, our world has changed. Our world as Jews in North America and in anywhere else, really, because we have been witnessing an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism across North America and globally. I just want to quickly mention, I like this definition of trauma by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration in the United States. Trauma is an event that takes place. It's, by the way, post-traumatic stress disorder is the only, of course, I'm sure you know it, the only diagnosis in the DSM nosology that actually requires the identification of an external event in outside reality. So this is the event, or what we call the index trauma. And then it requires the experience of the individual. The individual has to experience that event as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. And this event has lasting effects on that individual. And of course, we also know that one can be very severely traumatized, not only by what happens to oneself or by witnessing something happening to someone else, but also by hearing that somebody close to you suffered that kind of an experience, which would be the case for many of us hearing about what happened in Israel and elsewhere afterwards. So as you look at the definition of trauma, I just want you to keep in mind the fact that because of all of these elements being dynamic and interrelated, we see a great variability in the responses that Holocaust survivors themselves had to the trauma that they suffered. And certainly there's great variability in the second generation and in descendants of survivors. And that cannot be overstated. There's a great variability, and yet there are certain features and characteristics which we see in large samples across the world. So just to mention that it took quite a while for the mental health professions to acknowledge that there would be even long-term effects of the Holocaust on the survivors themselves, and recognizing the fact that there is such a thing as intergenerational transmission of effects related to something that the children born to Holocaust survivors did not even experience themselves, right? The Holocaust ended before they were born. The acknowledgement that there could be effects that are transmitted to these children who did not experience the trauma themselves. That took until the early 1970s. However, even though we did not find in any of the research, and by now it's a large body of very robust empirical studies, there is no evidence for psychopathology in the group of children of survivors as a group, but we definitely have certain characteristics that paint a profile. And I'll be talking about a couple of the most important aspects of this profile with regards to the topic of how we respond to October 7th and the anti-Semitism that we've been witnessing since. So our families and the research on our families actually opened the gate to the recognition of these concepts of long-term standing effects of trauma in the lives of survivors, of intergenerational effects of trauma, and not only to the children of survivors, but to multiple generations. And the idea that there is such a thing as historical trauma began to be recognized and finally sort of formally acknowledged by SAMHSA, for example, and in many other, based on many other studies in trauma-exposed populations, all of which recognize the connection, when you go to read them, the connection to the research on Holocaust survivors. This quote about what historical trauma is, I actually take from studies that were done in indigenous Native Americans. And Braveheart, Maria Braveheart, stated a historical trauma is a cumulation of emotional and psychological wounding over the lifetime, over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. And these traumatic experiences are told in the public narratives of trauma-exposed groups. These stories of historical trauma, the way they are passed on in families and in the general narratives of the group that was exposed to it, are really the mechanisms or the vehicles that carry the memories of those historical events and shape the way future generations that didn't go through it view it and construct their experience. And these narratives, if you like, these narratives of historical trauma are not only stories of what happened in the past, and that is such an important point. They are actually a lens for meaning making in response to contemporary circumstances in the lives of current generations. They are the lens through which we look at what is going on in our own lives at the present. So recently, the interest in this connection between how historical trauma narrative impacts the way that we experience our own lives and things that happen to us, and how it influences our health, our well-being, psychologically and otherwise, the interest in that connection has definitely increased in recent years. And again, the people that I quote here are people from the literature about indigenous Native Americans, Mohat and Fitzgerald and colleagues. And what they sort of beautifully articulate is that the impact on a given person of historical trauma depends on the salience of this trauma to the individual themselves, because some people may find it more salient and some people may find it less salient to them personally, and the salience of that trauma in current public reminders that are happening right now. So I'm giving you here just one image from many, many that I could put here of some of the public reminders that we have all been exposed to over the recent year. This is the front page of the report by the Committee on Education and the Workforce in the United States House of Representatives about anti-Semitism in colleges. And if you look, by any means necessary, which is a very, very strong statement about, well, by any means necessary. And in fact, a person invited to speak at Barnard College just this past week, when asked if she justifies rapes and kidnapping, shrugged her shoulders, and there was laughter in the audience. So this is what we're facing these days in terms of public reminders of past pogroms and Jew hatred. Salience of these reminders has been very high on campuses, university campuses. There's been an inordinate rise in anti-Semitic incidents. There has been, I can tell you, many, many examples, and I can share with you because I actually try to collect them. There is a group of Jewish faculty and Israel support faculty at Columbia. We have a WhatsApp group. We share a lot of information amongst us, and there is really quite a lot about silencing by other faculty members, of Jewish faculty members. There are all kinds of things that are happening, no response by administration to complaints by faculty and students who are Jewish about being harassed, all kinds of things. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism in public narratives, on the media, in public spaces, in professional forums, and in professional organizations. This is something I will not get into the details of, but those of you who want to look at some of the bigger picture of data, larger data, there have been several large-scale surveys by the ADL, by the AJC, that show just how severe is the sharp rise in anti-Semitism in recent times. And it culminates here in the quote that I have there from Christopher Wray, who testified during a Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee hearing on Capitol Hill on October 31st last year, and said that anti-Semitism is reaching historic levels in the United States. So these are just bits and pieces to show you the salience of the trauma in public spaces and public narratives right now. As a community, all Jews, I think, carry to some extent the memory of the pogroms throughout history and the Holocaust, the catastrophe that really impacted such a large part of our people and decimated communities only 80 years ago. And this past year has been therefore a traumatic time because of the reminder of that, because of the existential threat to Israel, and because of the unbelievable seismic rupture, if you like, in the sense of safety for Jews globally. And this seismic rupture in their sense of safety has been, I think, particularly significant for North American Jews, because this is the diaspora where Jews have assimilated and acculturated and adapted and succeeded more than in any other diaspora through the history of the Jewish people, while being able to be comfortable maintaining their Jewish identity in the various ways that North American Jews have kept their Jewish identity. For Holocaust survivors and for their descendants, the personal history of connection to family that was in the Holocaust makes the salience, the personal salience of all of these things even much higher, of course. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So before I go into the intergenerational transmission and the sensitivities that are associated with it, I'll talk to you about a couple of very particular aspects that I want to highlight in terms of the trauma that the survivors lived through. There is a very difficult book by Depre called The Survivor: An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps. And he describes what he calls the excremental assault. And he says, it began in the train, in the locked box cars, 80 to 100 people per car, crossing Europe to the camps of Poland. In these overcrowded conditions, deprived of food and drink, prisoners had at most a crude bucket in which to manage their waste. Urine and feces soon spread all over. And I skip down to the bottom, from ghetto to transport to camp. This became the new permanent condition whereby the prisoner lived in her own waste and that of other prisoners. These are the aspects that survivors rarely actually articulate because they are so difficult to share and to talk about. But why was it important for me to talk about it? Because these are very important aspects of dehumanizing the survivors. And what we know now, using neuroaffective studies, is that people do not necessarily ascribe a fully experiencing mind to the other, and thus do not inevitably recognize that other as a fully human person, yes? So others we see from neuroaffective studies that if somebody is perceived by us as very disgusting or not exactly having a fully working human mind, then our brain actually doesn't process that person in the same way that we process other people whom we perceive as equally human as us. It actually has been shown that these people whom we feel are disgusting or whom we see as not having a fully working human mind are processed in a different part of the brain, which is not singularly dedicated to social cognitions. It is where other things, not quite social, and objects are processed. Why is that important? Because apparently the Nazis actually created a situation whereby the survivors, by the time they got to the camps and the cars were open, they were so stinky and filthy and disgusting that it became much easier to treat them as less human than me, as not quite human. And when we dehumanize somebody, it becomes a lot easier to do things to them that we wouldn't do to other people whom we feel are as human as us. The issue of the not so well working mind, which also leads our brain to treat someone as not quite human, and therefore raises some possibility or risk of that person being treated not as well, is particularly relevant to those of us who work in medical settings or long-term care settings where the patients and the clients are there because they do not have anymore a fully working human mind. So here is a beautiful picture painting by Paul Kornowski, really his full name was, who was a child survivor. This is how people came to the camps, like people with relationships, with clothes, with emotions, with belongings, and this is what they became. A figure that is kind of humanoid, but not fully human because it is stripped of all of its human characteristics from the eyes of the perpetrator. And that's what they became, which is much different than the typical individual and much easier to dehumanize. The effects of this trauma, as seen from a meta-analysis of 71 studies on survivors that were collected many, many years after the Holocaust, show the two pillars in the center are the levels of post-traumatic stress disorders after many, many decades after the end of the war. So you see that those symptoms, both in community residing samples and in survivors that did seek some help, that's why we have two pillars there. They're very, very high. I don't need to go over the PTSD diagnosis with you, I'm sure. I just wanted to emphasize that in the most recent diagnosis of PTSD, there has been a significant change, and that was the added element of recognizing that sometimes there are alterations in people's way of being in the world that go beyond the 3 clusters of symptoms that we had in the previous diagnosis. So beyond hyperarousal and intrusive phenomena and avoidance. Alterations that go beyond it, that have to do with the way they perceive and relate to themselves, to others, spiritual beliefs, and so on. And those differences and the symptoms that go along with them, we see them also in subclinical presentations. So people who don't have the full symptomatology, where we would be more easily able to diagnose them as having PTSD, still suffer from a lot of those symptoms. And also important to remind us that PTSD is not the only post-traumatic reactions. Some people don't have some of the symptoms of PTSD and have instead a lot of depression and intense anxiety, other things. And that is also very important to know. And as I said, the symptoms persist for decades. We see it in all kinds of people who survived World War II. And right now, the people that you are likely to meet are going to be mostly child survivors. The other ones, sadly, are passing very quickly or have passed already. So we see it also in other children who lived through World War II who are not Jewish. Just a few examples there. Of course, we see it also in much more recent children from Rwanda, from Bosnia, and from other conflict zones. I also want to highlight very, very much that we know that vulnerabilities in survivors and in their children exist alongside a lot of resiliencies. So many of the survivors themselves may have led very productive lives and may have appeared very well integrated, capable, and successful in many, many aspects of life. And in particular, that is true about child survivors, who in many senses, as Robert Krell, a Canadian child survivor, psychiatrist, one of the founders of the Holocaust Studies Center in Vancouver, and one of the people I most admire in the world, as he said, child survivors are desperately preoccupied with normality, with belonging, with coping, with not being identified as different. And so they really managed to succeed in unbelievable and in unexpected ways. And they did not look as if they were very injured, but sometimes in old age, the pain and some sort of existential psychological distress surfaces, sometimes even really to the level of an impairment or a dysfunctionality that sets in, and we can talk about some examples later. And in others, the pain might manifest itself simply in psychological distress, or more frequently even in somatic forms, which are then very often missed as symptoms of PTSD. Because what do we expect from older people? We expect that they will have all kinds of somatic complaints. And so I just want to highlight that studies show beyond doubt that PTSD is related to just about every possible health condition in the later years. It is an inordinately strong finding that it is associated or is a very high risk factors for just about any illness. So we are likely to meet a lot of trauma survivors in their later years in medical settings, even when they come only, so to speak, because of illness and because of somatic symptoms of some kind. As a result of that, as I said, there is an under recognition of PTSD Actually, there's an under-recognition of PTSD in all ages, but certainly in the older population. So it's very, very important that we will understand that we have to always, in a very matter-of-fact way, in a very respectful way, try to include in the very initial evaluation or assessment of a patient whether there's a possibility that they lived through some very traumatic times or traumatic circumstances. Survivors sometimes, as we know, are therefore care recipients of multiple or different levels of care. And here I had a little bit of a conundrum. Who am I addressing in terms of the audience today? Are you treating people who are in long-term care facilities? Are you treating people in nursing homes? Or are you treating people in the community who are in independent settings? That makes, of course, a very big difference. But generally speaking, when I just stay at the very general level of survivors as care recipients in any of the levels, we do know that they have special needs, as Rachel stated in her introduction, and that they have different responses, and that many things can be triggering for them. And the triggers, mind you, might be completely imperceptible sometimes to others, and might even be difficult for the survivor themselves to recognize, that's what triggered me. So here is an example. It's not a real something that someone gave me. I took it off of the internet. This is laundry hanging on a string. And it's an example because somebody, a survivor from Bosnia, told me about a beautiful day he was having with his family. They were going down this beautiful street in this beautiful town, and they were all having a good day. And all of a sudden, he saw this laundry hanging, which was moving in the wind. And it reminded him of a terrible scene that he saw of people who had been hanged. And that totally changed his mood and threw him into a very bad kind of, triggering of PTSD. And it was very hard to get out of it. Now, sometimes the person recognizes what triggered it. Sometimes the person doesn't. And what's most important is to show you that no one else could have imagined what actually happened to this guy right now. What triggered him? What changed his mood? Why is he acting so difficult all of a sudden and ruining everybody's day? I want to share with you a concept that I call the dual reality of trauma. And Rachel, I have until I have another 12 minutes or something.
No, closer to 22. You're good.
Okay. So what I call the dual reality is an observation that I have been making over the 30 years of working with survivors and the second generation, that they actually live in two parallel frames of reference, for psychological frames of reference for how we experience life. And I say we because I am a daughter of survivors as well. So in one frame of reference, that is the one that was, let's say, the appropriate one created for most of us born after the war in the relative safety of our lives when things were still safe. It was before October 7. It was before the rise of anti-Semitism. We felt safe. You, North American second generation, certainly felt, I think, very safe in your country, in your society. And you had certain concepts about what's expected from people, how people behave, how you are perceived, how you are supposed to behave. If you're, for example, at a buffet, well, and somebody wants to, somebody older is trying to reach the table with the food, you would step aside, you would let them to get to the table first, and so on. That's the reality of what's expectable under normative, relatively safe conditions. But for those people who lived through the Holocaust or other terrible traumatic circumstances, and for their children, there is another frame of reference of what happens under such terrible conditions, where inconceivable experiences that are totally incongruent with the reality, the safe reality of the here and now take place. In that reality, everything is different. People behave differently. The main motivation is to make sure that you get to the food, that you get the food for your child and not the other person. There are completely different expectations from perpetrators. Everybody else is a potential perpetrator. There are indifferent and even hostile bystanders. And like I said, even the victims themselves have to behave differently simply to maintain some chance of survival. And this other trauma reality that survivors and children of survivors carry with them is not an image or a frame of reference that pertains to something that happened in the past in a different time and place. It is actually an alternative view of reality. Forgive me for using that term, which is far too close to alternative facts these days. I don't mean it, of course, in any way that way. It's an alternative view of what people actually are always, and what people actually are capable of always, should the conditions turn into difficult, threatening conditions. So it is not about the past. It's just a realization, if you like, and a fear of what lies under the surface, under the thin veneer of civilization, as soon as conditions may call for a different kind of behavior. And so the persistence of these two parallel realities is really two frames of reference for everyday responses of survivors and children of survivors to what is happening in their lives, in their current lives. And this is the dual reality of survivors. It is also a dual reality that we see has been transmitted to their descendants. I like art, and I think art speaks very beautifully, more than words sometimes. And this is from a art project by Shimon Ati. He projected pictures of life in the Jewish ghetto. He projected them on abandoned buildings in the Jewish ghetto to convey the ephemeral quality of that dual reality, which is here and not here. You do see something here, it's there, it's the old man doing whatever he was doing, but it's not really the old man. It's there and it's not there at the same time. And one of the two things that I want to focus on in terms of the intergenerational transmission with regard to what we're living through right now is that one of the most robust areas of empirical findings about the descendants of survivors, the second generation, but also the third to some extent, is a heightened sensitivity to threat. We have a heightened sensitivity to threat. And what I showed you before, sorry, this was this picture. As you can see, this kind of memory that is ours and not ours. Other people called it their memory images. Judith Kestenberg called it the transposition of the parents' memories on our memory. Here, Marianne Hirsch called it post-memory. It's all similar. These concepts are similar to my concept of dual reality. Each of them has a slightly different flavor, but this is what we're talking about, is the experiencing of memories that are not really our own memories. And these memories are woven into our perception and interpretation of what is happening in our own current lives. It created what my friend and colleague Amit Shrira and his colleagues Dov Shmotkin and others called a hostile world scenario, a view of the world as much more threatening, a view of the world that has been from the get-go, from before October 7, very sensitized to adversity and characterized by hypervigilance and sort of expectation of potential danger, as captured in Linda Pastan's poem, which I started with. And the heightened sensitivity in children of survivors is particularly related to anything that bears associations with the Holocaust. So in the study that Rachel mentioned before, which I did on the reactions of children of survivors to the pandemic, to the COVID pandemic, for which I'm eternally grateful to Rachel and all of you who contributed their time and responded to the questionnaires. What we saw was that the most distressing part of the pandemic was anything that bore association to the Holocaust, the sight of broken glass in the streets and all kinds of public expressions that people had about the Holocaust, reminders of Anne Frank, all kinds of things like that. That was the most related to increased psychological distress in children of survivors, even more than the risk of the illness itself. So here is another image of the dual reality, and I'll tell you why I show it to you, because when I show that to children of survivors, what they see is this. They have an emotional reaction to this photograph as if it was a photograph of inmates in a concentration camp during the roll call in the morning, instead of simply seeing vine bushes in the snow. And if that is how much our emotional reaction can be dictated by our internal trauma scenario, imagine just how powerful the reaction is to what is happening right now, which is open, blatant anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, and threats to the existence of the state of Israel and to Jews in general. This is a painting of the roll call by a survivor, Boris Lurie. So let me check my time again. Just checking again, Rachel, how much do I have?
Just under 15 minutes left.
Okay. So how do we understand the transmission of trauma from parental survivor generation to children who have not lived through it? So very briefly, I will mention, and I'm sure there will be questions about it later, we know that there can be long-term biochemical changes in the DNA of survivors who lived through significant deprivation and under significant conditions of threat to life. And that can happen, we see it in many studies, that can impact the DNA of the mother, which then can impact the fetal development of the DNA of the child and can impact the child in the early years when the behavior of the survivor mother impacts metabolic processes and hormonal processes in the infant that can in turn change their DNA. We also have some studies that show that certain epigenetic changes, because this is what we call them, can also have impacted paternal DNA. Trauma also can change attachment styles and parenting styles in ways that communicate the trauma, and it has permeated in many homes and in many groups exposed to trauma. It has permeated the family environment, especially when survivors suffer post-traumatic or more significant post-traumatic reactions. As I said, there's great variability in the survivor families, in the survivors themselves. And so when the parent have more symptoms, more persistent symptoms, it permeated the family environment more significantly. And what we know is that when there are a lot of repressed and unprocessed feelings in the survivors, children develop a much, much stronger identification with their parents, which is something I'll say a couple of words more about. How are these states, internal states of the parent communicated to the child? We have now a lot of studies, fantastic studies by my colleague Beatrice Beebe at Columbia University. I will include the links to it. I strongly recommend anyone who, even for your own benefit, anyone who wants to see just how sensitive children, infants as young as 4 months are to the nonverbal behavior of caretakers should check out Beatrice Beebe's videos on YouTube, and Edward Tronick, who was the original person who did this type of studies, especially one called the still face experiment. So internal states of the parent are communicated non-verbally by facial expressions, gestures, gaze, vocal qualities, bodily movement, and by later on, as the infant becomes a child, by all kinds of what we call micro interactions that occur not naturally and normally in the life of the family, in the daily life of the family. So this is a picture of Edward Tronick's still face experiment. I cannot recommend it more strongly. Please watch it. And this is Beatrice Beebe's work. Please go and check it out on her YouTube channel, Beatrice Beebe. The later micro interactions, as I referred to them, are, for example, this page from Art Spiegelman's Mouse, where Mousy, the little child, comes home crying, and his father says, "Why do you cry, Artie?" And Artie says, "I was playing with my friends and I fell and they ran, they didn't wait for me." And his father very nonchalantly responds, "Friends? Your friends? If you lock them together in a room with no food for a week, then you could see what is friends." So what does that communicate to the child? And we can talk a lot more about it. What does that kind of a communication transmits to the child about the world, about their perception of the world, about their confidence in their own interpretation of social interactions, and about the existence of a completely different, much more hostile and threatening interpretation, which obviously the parents might have a good reason to hold because they survived the Holocaust. This is a quote from Sandra Hurtis, a book of small essays about the Holocaust, and that's another point that I want to highlight from our some of the main characteristics that are very typical we see for children of survivors, not only children of survivors of the Holocaust, but children of trauma-exposed parents. She says, you know, born in 1950, I was, at least on paper, American. But even as a young girl, I understood that being American meant being lighter and freer than I often felt. I was a painfully self-conscious child consumed with concern for my family's welfare. So that kind of intense intergenerational dependence, connectedness, overprotectiveness is a very powerful element. And here it is captured in a very beautiful and tender piece of art by Leah Weinberg. Here it is captured in its more brutal sort of harsh aspects as something that definitely at times felt like it was constricting the autonomy and the ability of the second generation to live their own lives and find their own direction. I also want to emphasize another very important point for those of you working with Holocaust families, and that is something about which I wrote a paper. I didn't find anything else about it in the literature. It is the impact of trauma on sibling relationships in Holocaust families. And what we see often are very, very intense cutoffs between adult siblings. And I see it as a direct enactment and result of this intense care for the parents, but also intense sense of being bound and not having enough autonomy. And and as you see here in this art, which I don't know anything about any Holocaust connection between Valerio Beruti, but he has these beautiful paint drawings of siblings. And what we see in research actually is that when there is not enough parental emotional availability, siblings either become very, very close, providing some of those functions to each other, or very, very hostile to each other and disconnected, each of them feeling that the other one got more. In Holocaust families, what I see is that each of the children sometimes developed very differently. We have what we call differentiation and de-identification in families between siblings. It's a normative process, but because the parents are perceived as so fragile in some ways and as having suffered so much, each child developed a very different way of trying to either be the good child and protect the parent, or emancipate themselves from the burden of it, and that causes intense resentments and judgments between them. So when you work with those families, you have to be aware of that in terms of part of the dynamics between the parents and the adult children, as well as between the adult children. Let me skip for a minute. So here we come to, it's just another study that my colleague conducted, which shows that in terms of the salience of what happened recently and how much it connects with our personal historical trauma for children of survivors and for their descendants, event centrality of the Holocaust has been shown to be much greater, of course, for survivors relative to their peers, in second generation relative to our peers, and even in the third generation relative to their peers. And here is a book which I recommend you read if you want. It's an illustrated story of being a second generation by Michel Kishka, who lives in Israel, who's a Belgian cartoonist. I want to show you briefly some results from a recent study that we conducted, my friend and colleague Amit Shrira in Israel and myself. He's a professor at Bar Ilan University. And what you see here, since we happen to have data from before the war, you see here in the blue depression, in the green anxiety, and you see pre-war and during the war, you see how much higher the graphs are. And here you see we talked about Holocaust linkage. We asked questions about to which extent participants were thinking about the Holocaust in relation to what happened on October 7th, and in relation to the anti-Semitic stuff that has been happening since. What you can see is the red is Holocaust-related participants. The blue is comparisons. As you can see, all of us have made some kind of direct linkage to the Holocaust. But if you look at the difficulties controlling such a linkage, sensory experiences during to the linkage, such as stomach aches, headaches, fatigue, all kinds of things like that, and visceral sensations due to that linkage, the reds, namely those of us who are descendants of Holocaust survivors, have had much, much more intense symptoms in relation to October 7th and the anti-Semitic rise since then. So let me go just quickly to a quote by Field and his colleagues. These are researchers who applied the knowledge from research on Holocaust families to Cambodian families of survivors of the Khmer Rouge. And he put it very beautifully in saying, Parents who continue to be psychologically affected by past trauma, such as trauma stemming from genocide, may communicate, even if indirectly, their emotional vulnerability to their children and thereby instill inordinate concern in the children for the parents' welfare. And yet, despite the fact that we see these very meaningful similarities between different trauma-exposed populations, there are also distinct differences. And some of the findings that we see in Black and Indigenous populations, people of color, I listed here, and some of the internalized consequences of being slaves in the United States, I'm listing here, and we can talk more about it. And I also wanted to mention there is already, and there's going to be a huge population of refugees, and that's yet another type of trauma and another type of added element of longing for the lost homeland, or for being or having been expelled from a loved homeland. But I will skip that. So there are many commonalities, but we also see differences that are very important. Some of them I highlighted here. For example, the Holocaust lasted 1 decade, as opposed to what the native indigenous people of North America suffered. However, the Holocaust, mind you, came on top of 2,000 years history of persecution of Jews in other countries and pogroms. The survivors who arrived in North America did not continue to live amongst the perpetrators of their trauma. Survivors were not prohibited from mourning, although they did not have graves. Jews could go back to their culture and traditions. It's much harder for the indigenous people or for the descendants of slaves. Jewish survivors were aided by established diaspora Jewish communities. This was not the case for other populations. Razma Menachem speaks of the pigmentocracy, the white body as the standard of humanity, and color as a mark of otherness, which many Jews, although not all, did not have to contend with, and many other things that we can talk about, which make for differences. And we have to remember that when we talk to people from a particular group that was exposed to a particular trauma, we have to familiarize ourselves with the distinctions of that particular experience. And also, we have to be very aware in working with survivors to not fall into hierarchies of suffering. Who suffered more and how does it compare to the suffering of somebody else? I want to stress one thing, which is that trauma therapy is not necessarily EMDR or exposure therapy or any of the other techniques. Trauma therapy as a general term is a much wider term that implies that you have very deep understanding of trauma and of its impact on all levels, and that you understand the neurological substrate, the emotional, the cognitive, the interpersonal aspects of it, and that you are able to utilize multiple techniques for trauma depending on the needs of particular people. I will quickly go here and just to get to, I'm sure what you want to hear is about the how we do it. And I apologize that perhaps we will do that a little bit more during the discussion, or I'll just take another 5 minutes. One of the things that we are aided in when working with survivors of the Holocaust and with children of survivors of the Holocaust right now is something that comes with age. We see in studies that the later years are associated with what we call better emotional complexity and cognitive complexity. Cognitive complexity means that when we are older and cognitively intact, hopefully, we are able to see more multiple truths at the same time, multiple perspectives and their validity at the same time, relative to younger people who have more of a black and white kind of thinking. And emotional complexity is the capacity to focus and enjoy positive experiences alongside or in the midst of negative experiences. And that's something that we can build on when we work with Holocaust survivors and children of survivors who are all also aging these days. We can talk later on about what is important to survivors, but what is particularly important that I cannot overemphasize is that it matters to them that you show interest in what happened to them, but that you are very respectful of the degree to which they want to talk about it, and that trust must be earned, because the dual reality and what they have been through teaches them that you may look really good on the outside and be an anti-Semite underneath it. So trust must be earned. Don't expect to have it right from the get-go. And what we want to do at this time is remember that these people that we are talking about, whether it's the survivors or the second generation in any trauma-exposed population, trauma and resilience are braided concepts. You cannot speak of resilience without there having been a trauma, because then you wouldn't know if the person is resilient or not, or the community is resilient or not. So trauma and resilience reside in the same place. And what we want is to encourage people to find their resilience and to find ways to connect with what we call post-traumatic growth, which is some positive aspects that come out of having gone through a difficult experience. And so some of the cornerstones of that work have to do with education, oftentimes psychoeducation, about why you are having these terrible feelings or conflicts or symptoms or interpersonal problems these days, and how it's related to PTSD, and not just to the fact that you might be a flawed person. And increase emotional regulation, which is anyway the cornerstone of mental well-being and mental health. Development of a narrative that allows people to shape their trauma into a story of resilience, and to recognize what helped them in the past and who were helpful people in the past, and what were their own strengths that they can reconnect with and try to mobilize now. That is very helpful. Finally, belonging, and especially to what was called in the literature same background group, or the social cure, which means studies show us that connecting with people who share the same background and being able to share your feelings with them is much more meaningful and helpful than belonging to other groups. So that is not to say that you cannot encourage your patients to belong to multiple groups, but definitely also to same background groups. Service and activation are always important in situations of any depression and anxiety, right? We want somebody to connect and to become active because it restores agency and purpose and all of those things. And we'll talk more about all of those things later. So I'll stop here, even though I have so much more that I could share, but we'll do that as we discuss. Thank you so much. Oh, one last thing. I want you to know that there is a new journal for mental health professionals and others by the Association of Jewish Psychologists, which is free to you right now. And that's the cover of the journal, Kesher. And my friend and colleague Jenny Frumer and I are running free drop-in groups, monthly drop-in groups for second generation and for child survivors. So you're welcome to send people to join us. Thank you very much. I'm gonna give it back to you, Rachel.
Thank you. That was amazing, Irit. Thank you so much. You obviously have so much to teach us, and your perspective is really very, I think, helpful for everyone. We'll dive into some of the questions in the Q&A, and yeah, people can just keep writing in their questions as we go through. And I think you're right that we'll get at some of the like more nuanced strategies in the questions. So I'm going to just quickly say that we will be circulating, for those of you who missed this announcement at the beginning, we'll be circulating some handouts from Irit with the names and resources that she mentioned. So don't worry about that in a follow-up email. So look for that follow-up email from us. And then let's just get at the at this question I saw here, that a person is asking, can you give some examples of ways a professional can show sensitivity and respect to a Holocaust survivor or their family, particularly when the professional is not a Jewish person seen by the Holocaust survivor or their family as goyim?
As what? As goyim?
Goyim, yeah, a goy, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is of course a very, very important point. I think that all we can do is try to communicate very directly that, you know, you don't share, you know, that family history, but you know that this is something that is in this family's background, and that you are very you can even say, I am very respectful of it. I would be very interested in hearing about it to the extent that you would like to share it with me.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best we can do. That's the same as I can do when I get a non-Jewish Bosnian patient or client, yes, or an indigenous client.
Right. And of course, you don't have to necessarily be in the same, you know, group as someone to help them or treat them.
No.
Okay. So another question we have, there is a resident in a nursing home, a child survivor, who can't tolerate being alone, divorced and estranged from his son. How would you suggest to best help him?
Yeah, this is a very, very problematic thing. I've seen it many, many times. In fact, a colleague of mine in Brooklyn used to lead a group lead a group and also work with a group of over 70 survivors who were like that, lonely, disconnected from children, from previous spouses and all of that. But it can also happen, of course, to people who had a more normative life path. I think that happens. That's a very, very good example of what I said about the stuff that sometimes comes up in the later years, especially with dementia or cognitive impairment. We see that oftentimes brings up a lot of the affect and a lot of the fears, and they don't necessarily recognize that it's related to their Holocaust experiences. But think about it very simply, right? Child survivor. I had a child survivor who told me, you know, how she was alone during the Holocaust, every day waiting for her mother to come back, but being very clear about the fact that her mother might not come back. Now, that level of fear is intense. What can we do? We need to, first of all, understand it as a post-traumatic reaction. We need to validate it and respect it. I can tell you that I have had previous contacts with mental health professionals, including some very good psychiatrists, who told me, there isn't such a thing. It's got nothing to do with the Holocaust. It's just part of sundowning. All patients with dementia have it. Yes, all patients have sundowning, and all patients with dementia have all kinds of symptoms, but Holocaust survivors have unique symptoms, and veterans with PTSD have unique symptoms. So we have to try to understand it and validate it and figure out what we can do in that particular setting. Does it help that person if there's a TV going on? Does it help that person if there is something else talking to him? Does it help him if there is, I don't know, in some nursing homes, it's possible to have a cat. Does it help him to have visitors? Is it, I don't know, is that person calm enough and able to share a room with somebody? We have to try to figure out in which way we can somehow bring a presence into his life, into his room, because it's so, so painful for him.
Thank you. And sort of another clinical question, could you provide a few more examples of how the trauma shows up in medical settings and how to address that? And then the example that's given is like the inability to tolerate incontinence.
Ah, that's a big one. That exactly is related to what I shared with you about what the press called the excrement assault. Yeah. And I'm so grateful for this question, because of course it's a very, very common thing for people who are in long-term care or nursing homes, that people might not be able to come right away to change them. And it's very, very upsetting to a person who was reduced to having to live like that, with the feeling of it, with the stench of it, with the shame of it, for all of those days and months and years as a Holocaust survivor. So it's very important to understand the connection, and to understand that for people who suffered that, it might feel very much more urgent, not because they are entitled and impatient and not good patients, but because it really triggers in them something that is much more visceral and terrible than in another patient. You know, if you read Tuesdays with Morrie, right, and you read how he experiences their needing to have his, body care be done by a caretaker, he describes there the patient, yes, the professor with Louis Gehrig disease. Morrie describes how he tells him that he goes in his mind to the beautiful memories of his mother taking care of him as a child. That's a very different state of mind to go back to than the state of mind of someone who experienced intense shame and self-disgust and disgust by others reflected to him. And the scent of it and the sensation of it brings all of that back.
Yeah, thank you. Next question, do you have any observations or specific researchers you recommend for learning more about 2G and 3G families? Point one is sibling dynamics and birth order. And point two is existentialist and spiritual difficulties across the lifespan and across generations. Like a complex question.
Okay, that's a complex question to which I could give a seminar as a response. So I'll try to do my best. Okay, about sibling order, the research that we have has not at all given conclusive results as to which child suffered more, the firstborn or the youngest, or because there are many reasons why in some families it was the firstborn and in some families it was the youngest, and all kinds of things like that. So there is inconclusive results about that, although there is a general finding that definitely firstborns got a lot of the brunt of parents being close to their liberation, very new in their host countries, economically and financially not established, barely speaking the language. So the firstborns definitely got the brunt of it. And I always remind that to siblings, younger siblings who are upset with their firstborn, that they owe them a debt for having absorbed a lot of that toxic hand-me-down, yes, from the parents. So that's one thing. The only paper that I can think of that is directly addressing it about sibling relationships is the paper that I mentioned by myself. There was one earlier paper from years ago by Shirion, also about siblings. So these two really are the only ones that I know of that address that specifically. As to the spiritual and what was it?
Existential.
I mean, there is so much that one could recommend. I would recommend Bukiet's book, what's it called? It has the like the Auschwitz thing, Arbeit macht frei. Its title is Work Does Not Make You Free, or something like that, by Bukiet. There is also a beautiful one addressing spirituality. Just one second, let me go. You know what? I will send it to you afterwards.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a great idea. Thank you.
And I will send the papers too. And I
Perfect.
will
Yes.
send a bunch of other readings that people can sort of decide if they're of interest and relevance to them or not.
Perfect. And I think this question was maybe in response to you sort of defining the second generation, but someone was asking, could this possibly explain the reluctance to take risks or make changes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, if you, first of all, and it's a much more complex question and a much more nuanced answer than I will be able to give right now. But if you think about the characteristics of the transmission creates, as I said, a certain insecurity about our own ability to understand the world, because a child develops with these two frames of reference that they know from a very early age. Not only do we absorb them, we also come to understand that there is a reality to it, that this helped maybe the parents survive, so we can't dismiss it. It is perhaps another reality. And if you absorb this hostile world script, then it's a much more threatening world to operate in than a world in which everything is a lot less threatening. It also interferes with children's agency and with children's confidence in going out there and doing their thing, as we could see from some of the artwork that I showed you about the interconnectedness, the lack of autonomy, the sense of not being able to go out and explore and do what you want, because from a very early age, for example, it means causing tremendous anxiety and pain to these parents who suffered so much. So you can't do it. So maybe, first of all, you get less practice doing it. And second, you sort of get this sense that it's bad to do it. And you get the sense that it's at the cost of somebody else when you do it. It's a much more complicated and nuanced thing that basically, for many children of survivors, and especially women, because what I didn't get to say here is that, of course, there are important ways in which gender differentiates the nature of intergenerational transmission. So for many, many women in particular, it hampered their capacity to go out and do things. And when it did that to men, then the impact was much more impairing and dysfunctional.
That's interesting. There are obviously like many lenses you can kind of look at.
Many lenses, but you know, when a woman is sort of not so brave and doesn't go to college far away, but to the college nearby, and doesn't take the job that would have taken her to, I don't know, Vancouver, but stays near the parents, it's more socially acceptable and there is a good face to put on it. When a man doesn't do it and therefore remains very limited and very connected and very inhibited, it's a much more obvious debilitating influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have about 7 minutes left. So there's one more question about the like specific clinical treatment question orientation. And then we have a couple that are connected to the current moment in Israel. So let's just do the first one and then we'll try and get to the last ones.
Yes.
Someone is asking, how do we change or influence the hospital nursing home culture so medical professionals are more in tune with your evidence and consider these needs or the survivors? And obviously, like being a part of a webinar like this is a great first step, but I imagine this person's asking kind of more broadly. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a bit.
Look, I think that there's no other way other than actually providing specific education about trauma and about how it, what it means in the old age and how it is related to the life of survivors in nursing homes. And here I will tell you something that is very, very meaningful to me personally. And when I talk to nursing homes directors and people and nursing home social service directors and so forth, I always include this story. I had an aunt who was in a nursing home, yes, in Israel, and I came to visit her, and in the bed next to her lay a woman who was already completely not able to interact with her surroundings. She was basically this very large, bloated mound of organic matter that had no cognition or responsivity. And really, it was very easy to treat her as if she wasn't there. And then one day when I came, someone put a poster the size of half a big page of, like bigger than 24 by 18, like a big half poster size, blow up photograph, not of her, of her husband in mid-action, smoking, and in mid-action sort of talking to somebody. And that man, as I say, honest to God, was simply hot. He was like a movie star. And all of a sudden, you recognize that this woman was loved by this man. He and her were like us. They were younger, they were more beautiful, they loved each other. So what do I say? I think that it is critical, especially in nursing homes where people are cognitively impaired, and the more impaired, the more important it is to have on their wall a very, as large as possible, blow up picture of this patient when they were more like us, meaning in midlife, not old, not crinkled, not bald, when they looked like the average middle-aged or whatever humanoid, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And why that big size? Because it convinces our brain to look at it almost as if they are there, like real size of a person. And why in mid-action? Because it makes it even more convincing for our brain that they are really there, as opposed to just a frozen or static or posed image. And even better, if they are in interaction with somebody. Because what we know from neuroaffective studies is that about dehumanization and all of that stuff, which I only touched upon before, is that if the person, if we, the caretaker, think in our own mind about the mind of the other person, their processing in our brain goes back to the area where strictly social cognitions are processed, namely, even if they are no longer, they don't have a functioning mind and they don't look like the average humanoid. If in our own mind we think about their mind, which means we think about what might they have liked or not, even if it's down to, I wonder if they liked broccoli or not, or which was their favorite holiday, or which was their favorite food. And certainly when we think about the fact that they loved somebody, that they were loved by somebody, and if we see them in interaction with somebody, life-size if possible, or as close as possible to it, our brain goes back to processing them as fully human. It reminds our brain of their full humanity, and it allows us to be much more empathic and much less influenced by the automatic reaction that our brain has to disgusting things and to people who are perceived as not human. And let's be honest, there's a lot of disgusting about the care of old people in nursing homes. So we have to acknowledge the reality of it. We have to incorporate what we learn about it from science and how to counter it, how to make it easier for people to counter that reaction, which they don't control. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's actually, I think, a really like low tech solution, right?
Low tech solution, so important.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, when I looked at that poster, that photograph of that hot guy, I
Mhm.
could literally hear the click in my brain. I was like, ooh.
Right.
And she became a person to me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I think a strategy that a lot of people, whether they're in the caregiving end or on the clinical end, I think is actually pretty
I
simple.
also think that it's very, very helpful to have some kind of either something written about who this person was. You know, I was one example was somebody that all of a sudden the staff learned she was a big ballerina and actually performed in some of the best ballets halls and best halls in the world. You know, it changes the way you look at the person.
Mhm.
We
I
can't
think,
help it.
yeah,
And it's
yeah, no,
easy. It's just to put something written up on the wall or some picture of her as she performed
right.
as a ballerina or something.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're basically at our time. I want a couple minutes, maybe just 1 minute of thank yous. And then I think just thank you from us as the Toronto Holocaust Museum. Thank you from me as a grandchild, and as someone who is always trying to like think about my existence and the world around me. I know from the chat, we're getting a lot of comments that people are feeling really validated, and that they've learned so much from you. So really, really appreciate that. Appreciate everything that you do in the world, from the support groups to the papers that you're publishing and the studies that you're running. You're helping so many people, and we're really grateful for the tools and the ideas that you've shared with us today that help us approach our work with greater understanding and greater compassion for others. And I just want to quickly thank our partners, the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence and UJA's Human Services, One Community Cares. Thank you everybody for joining us, whether it was your lunch break or you carved out the time. We really appreciate it. We hope you will come and join us again. Today we're marking Holocaust Education Week, and we hope you will consider joining us for our closing night program in honor of Kristallnacht this Sunday evening, November 10th, in person at Shari Tefillah. And we look forward to sharing many more meaningful learning opportunities together. Thank you so much. Thank you, Irit. And we will follow up with resources, ways to connect and learn more. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Rachel, would you please share with me the chat? I would love to see
Yes,
it. And
absolutely.
thank you to all of those who attended today. It was really a great honor. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.